Hi everyone, and welcome to this week's edition of Trans Stupid, where I take a look at the wonderful world of LGBTQ2SIAPPA, because for some reason that's an acronym, news, because stupidity is intersectional. So the first thing I want to discuss today involves a Church of England school where the vicar resigned after he said he'd been silenced over their plan to keep an 8-year-old pupil's sex change a secret from parents. The Reverend John Parker, a governor at the school, supported the boy's wish to become a girl, but said he was silenced when he raised concerns that parents and pupils would be kept in the dark. He also feared that staff and governors had been misled by the transgender lobby group Mermaids, which had been invited in to advise the school. After his worries were dismissed by the bishop, Mr. Parker quit the church, where he had been a vicar for 14 years, and also the school after 7 years as a governor. In an emotive resignation letter to his bishop, Mr. Parker wrote of his fear that children were being sacrificed on the altar of trans ideology. According to the Daily Mail, Mr. Parker said, "I was basically told by my bishop that if I wished to faithfully follow the teachings of the Bible, then I was no longer welcome in the church. It felt very much like I was being silenced by the church and the school." Mr. Parker was told in March that an 8-year-old pupil will be transitioning from a boy to a girl at the primary school in an Essex village. He raised concerns that the school had no formal policy on how staff should deal with a child who wanted to change gender. There was no guidance to cover matters such as whether the student would be allowed to use the girls' toilet or share changing rooms and accommodation with female pupils during trips away. He was equally keen to receive assurances that other pupils and parents would be told about the student's transition so they could be prepared. He also asked for evidence that the child had seen a psychologist or medical professional to ensure the desire to live as a girl was not being driven by his parents, but his request was denied. The vicar also questioned whether any pastoral provisions had been made for Christian parents and children who might be confused as to what was going on at the school, but Mr. Parker said when he put these points to a head teacher at a meeting, she dismissed them as merely being his personal views, and she went on to say she was legally bound by the Equality Act not to deviate from the way she was already handling the transition, and parents would not be informed about what was happening. When Mermaids visited the school back in April to give diversity training about trans children, according to Mr. Parker, they aggressively shut down any questions he had, with the instructor saying, "My job is to deliver training. I have done that. I don't have to listen." The head teacher also told him that it's not that because it's a training session, it wasn't the time to share his viewpoints. Trans children are always going to be a touchy subject, regardless of where you lie on the whole trans debate. I don't think the real controversy about this is that an 8-year-old is transitioning. As I've made points of in the past, I do believe that children can suffer from gender dysphoria, and a managed transition, one which is supported by medical professionals, is very important if they are going to go down that route. The real concern that I have with all this, however, is the way in which they're not giving any kind of message to the other children or other parents who might be involved in the school. It just seems to be a case of Jimmy is now Susie. That's it. No questions. Children are quite inquisitive. Are they not going to be allowed to ask a question as to what's happening? What about the parents of the kids when they come home from school? They're going to talk about this. And I think it's fair for parents to be properly prepared for this. You can't just pretend that Jimmy was Susie all along. You know, this isn't the Ministry of Truth here. You can't just rewrite history to suit your own ends. It doesn't surprise me that Mermaids came into the school as well to deliver this kind of training and were not happy to answer any questions that went against their own viewpoints. Mermaids are being seen more and more and more as an advocacy group and not just a charity that supports trans children. They do not like their doctrine being questioned, and it is quite concerning if you get a group in like that to deliver the message about children with gender dysphoria. This is why I would like to see an actual movement being made for trans kids that does not either lie on the side of all genders are valid, so do not question in the way that Mermaids does, Well, at the same time, you have groups like Transgender Trends who while say that they acknowledge that children can have gender dysphoria, it doesn't appear to be mentioned anywhere in their literature that could indeed be a reason why someone is transitioning. You need to be able to get a balance between these two groups if you want to help these kids. Acknowledge that, yes, children can have gender dysphoria, but at the same time, don't assume that everything a child says is 100% accurate either. Now, one of the biggest stories of the last week involving trans issues is one which actually does kind of concern me, and I've needed to do a little bit of reading into it to kind of get a bit more of an idea of what the actual issue is. Some of you might be aware that the World Health Organization has removed guidelines that mean that gender identity disorder is no longer seen as a mental health condition. So what we've seen from a lot of trans activists over the last couple of years when it comes to trans healthcare is moves to depathologization. Now what this basically means is that they no longer want to have trans issues to be kind of seen as a medical condition, as they believe that it being seen as a medical condition is a form of stigma. That groups believe that classing gender identity disorder as a mental health condition opens trans people up to abuse, whether it's like from people in the streets or from the fact that a GP might need to check you out before you get the medication. So according to transactivist.org, after moving trans-related categories out of the chapter on mental health, the next steps in the process involve getting rid of the remaining pathologizing language and advancing towards legal depathologization and universal health coverage. In 2018, a technical process on the ICD-11, International Classification of Diseases, 11th revision, was completed and the outcomes publicly announced. The next step is for the WHO to officially adopt it, which is expected to happen on the 27th of May, and that did take place. They also said that trans-related categories have been removed from the chapter on mental and behavioural disorders, which means that trans identities are formally de-psychopathologized in the ICD-11, and new trans-related categories have been added to chapter 17 on conditions related to sexual health, one of the 5 new chapters in the ICD-11. Transactivist.org say, although placement in this chapter is an improvement, it is by no means perfect. It is somewhat reductive to define trans health as related only to sexual health. We consider the ICD-11 to be a transitional version, ironically, acceptable only as a step towards depathologization, with 2 new categories being gender incongruence of adolescence and adulthood and gender incongruence of childhood. So gender incongruence has been contested by trans and gender diverse activists involved in the reforms, and collective submissions on alternative wording and criteria have been made. But again, it's accepted only as a temporary and imperfect solution to the needs of those trans and gender diverse people who require access to specific healthcare. The decision was very difficult to make and ultimately was made based on international solidarity and a strong shared commitment to continue to make submissions to the WHO on alternative wording and criteria. So the WHO hasn't removed being trans as a medical condition entirely. What they have done is they've just moved it from being a mental health condition to a sexual health condition. And naturally activists aren't happy about this because they want it to be completely demedicalized, because anyone can be trans. The idea of having gender dysphoria to a lot of these activists is harmful because they want to be able to just go into a corner shop apparently and buy hormones like it's a packet of sweets. Their attitudes towards this are absolutely ridiculous. When you go through a medical transition, as I have and others like me, you take various medicines, you have various surgeries, but you need to be sure you're doing the right thing by doing this. These are irreversible once you start going down the path, and you should only be doing it if you've got no other alternative in your life. I could not have gone on had I not been able to transition, and I needed that medical transition. By the time I got to 18, 19, that was the absolute limit for me in living in my previous life. These activists don't understand this. They just seem to think they act as though it's a new haircut, a new style, that anyone can just choose to take whatever drugs you want, whatever surgeries that you want to have, and there should be no repercussions for this. It's irresponsible. It's incredibly irresponsible. And I don't understand their whole problem of a stigma about it being a mental health condition. With all due respect, I don't think the average person on the street who's hurling like abusive language at trans women cares about what the WHO say. So what is the future of all this going to look like? Because as much as I see we need to demedicalise it all, how are the likes of the NHS or medical insurance companies going to cover a condition that you are pushing to no longer be seen as a condition? What is the incentive for them? I want these activists to think very, very carefully about what it is that they're doing, what it is that they are pushing. I want them to understand that there are going to be repercussions if they want to move on to full demedicalization of being trans. But what's more, again, they are mixing in the non-binary trans-trender ideas with people who have actual gender dysphoria. We have two very different needs here. Some of you just want to get a haircut and wear a dicky bow. Some of us need to get rid of our dick and grow tits. As crude as that sounds, it's kind of what the reality of all this is. We're different. If you don't want to be seen as having a medical condition, that's fine. But maybe don't call yourself trans. Maybe don't co-opt gender identity disorder. You know, why don't you just be NB and happy about this? I somehow doubt we're going to be living in this wonderful communist trans utopia where one can just go to wherever you want and pick up whatever surgeries or hormones that you might require without there being any kind of help from the NHS or from medical insurance companies. Not only will this stuff be sky high, but people might be quite cautious to give it out to a complete random stranger. There is a lot to take in with this kind of movement. I do not trust that trans activists have my interests at heart when they push this. I'm going to continue to follow on with this story, and I want to learn a lot more about exactly what their position is and why they think it's such a good idea to completely demedicalize what we have. This isn't like being gay, which they try and compare this to a lot. Gay people don't need any kind of medication to live their lives happily. They just need to be open about it. It's not the same with being trans. It isn't enough for us to just be open about it. We need the medical pathway. And the medical pathway and the gatekeeping that it gives is important to be sure that nobody is making a mistake. If you're actually trans, you should not care that there is a gatekeeper because you will already pass. I think the only people who are going to be worried about this are the people who maybe they aren't trans. But we will see in the future. So the last story I want to touch on today is probably going to be quite controversial with a lot of the trans community, but this is a point that I've mentioned in a previous video, in particular my one on Trans Day of Remembrance, and it does need to be said. In the past month, we have seen 3 murders of trans women of colour. This is Claire Legato, Tamika Washington, and Malaysia Booker. All 3 of these murders have been painted by the media as though they are victims of racism and transphobia. As a result, a narrative is being pushed out that we're living in an epidemic of trans violence. Now, before I continue, I don't want to be taken out of context with what I say. All 3 of these murders are a tragedy, and my heart goes out to the people who have been personally affected by this, their friends, their families, their loved ones. It must be very difficult. And in particular with Malaysia Booker, I do remember a video came out in April when she had been assaulted, and it was incredibly vicious. It's absolutely disgusting. But were they murdered because of transphobia or because of other contexts? Well, Chad Felix Green, a journalist for The Federalist, says no, they weren't murdered because they were trans, saying pretending transgender people are being murdered for being trans instead of due to random violence just stokes fear and reeks of political motives. Chad goes on to discuss the circumstances of the 3 murders. Claire Legato, who was 21, was shot on April 15 this year, but then she died from those injuries back on the 14th of May. According to police, Legato was at home with her mother and a man named John Booth. Legato's mother was in an escalated argument with Booth, accusing him of stealing her tax refund check. During the altercation, Claire confronted Booth and then left the house. Booth followed Claire and shot her in the head. He was charged with assault in connection with the shooting. Tamika Washington was shot multiple times and died an hour later in the hospital. Washington's alleged killer, Troy Bailey, has been arrested, and police believe the murder was the result of an attempted robbery as neither individual knew each other. Bailey has been charged with murder, possession of a firearm with an altered manufacturer's number, and violations for carrying a firearm as a former convict and without a license, among other crime. With Malaysia Booker, Chad mentions the assault that she encountered back in April. The assault appears to have been purely based on road rage, and there's no evidence that it was actually fueled by transphobia. However, on May 19th, Booker was found dead with gunshot wounds on a street. The police are currently investigating, but have found no evidence to address if the murder was retaliatory or bias motivated. There are no current suspects or witnesses to the crime. Now, Chad's article is actually incredibly good, and this, as I've mentioned, This is a very important point that I think a lot of the trans community needs to hear, and it's one that I've previously mentioned. Yes, these murders are indeed a tragedy. However, to paint this as being transphobia or we're in an epidemic of transphobic violence just appears to be motivated purely as political point scoring. To say to the rest of the community, look, we're living in terror. Look at what's happened to these 3 women over the past month. This shows that we're living in an epidemic of murder, but every single one of these women who was killed has their own unique circumstances that led to that death. As we've seen, 2 of them involved robbery. The 3rd one, we don't even know the motive. But we seem to be very eager, as soon as a trans person dies, to say, must be because they're trans. That there could be absolutely no other reason as to why someone would die if they're trans. This is ludicrous. Without there being transphobia as a motive, I cannot agree that this is because they were trans. I'm not saying that transphobia could not be a motive in any of these. Of course it could, but you've got to show it if you're going to be making that assertion. Unfortunately, none of these activists ever do show that. All they do is they say it and expect to not get questioned, because as soon as you question them, they flip out on you. Like, oh, you must be racist and transphobic. How dare you question us for our rhetoric on this? You're spreading misinformation, and what's more, you're spreading fear. You're spreading the idea that people are being attacked just for this one particular reason, and so you need to be extra careful when you leave the house. That there could be someone just around the corner, a transphobe waiting to shoot you. Transphobes waiting on the street, not to rob people, not as muggers. I mean, the robbery itself is apparently not a good motive. Wanting to steal people's stuff, nah. No, it's all about because they hate the tranners. That's entirely it. That's the only reason why this happens. And you know that the statistics from Trans Day of Remembrance are going to reflect all this yet again, because they always do. And this goes back to why I hate Trans Day of Remembrance. It's misleading. It gives you the idea that people are dying for reasons that they probably aren't. These trans women live in dangerous environments. Clearly. How many of the people watching this video can say they live in similar circumstances? I'm willing to bet it's not a lot of you. You can only really compare these kinds of murders happening with other people in the exact same situation. People who might find themselves falling in with a dangerous crowd or living in an area with quite high levels of street crime. I think we need to be more careful when we use this kind of rhetoric. It just provokes hysteria. The last point I just want to make on this, as with Trans Day of Remembrance, you are using victims of violence to push an agenda here. You've seen that 3 trans women have been murdered. All 3 of them are black. And you are using that to push your narrative. You have politicised their deaths, and you feel okay with that, because no one's questioning you. I think that's disgusting. You don't know why they were murdered, if it turns out that it was motivated purely on them being trans. If that was quite a big factor in their deaths, I'm willing to concede that point. I'm willing to say that, yeah, if people are being shot because they are trans, that is an issue. But that's not what's happening, is it? Because you do not know. But unless there's actual evidence that supports this, not just that they would just so happen to be trans, but anything which actually says that you can see that this person was going after them just because they were trans, you cannot make that assertion. And I want to make this point because not enough people are. Like, if I got murdered, I'd be very surprised if it was due to me being trans. And I'm sure some of you who are about to go into the comments and tell me how much of a bigot I am would probably agree with that statement. I am not saying that these deaths are not a tragedy, because they really, really are. But do not use them as political weapons. Wait for the investigation to be complete, at least. Otherwise, you're being disingenuous and you're pushing panic in a community that has already been told that they're nothing but victims. So what do you think of the stories I've covered this week? Please let me know in the comments. I'm sorry there hasn't been another video out this week. I've been taking a little bit of a break, but I am going to be getting more and more videos out. I've got quite a few good ones up in the pipeline. But if you like my stuff, please follow me on Twitter. You can also support me on Patreon or Subscribestar. Thank you all again, and I'll see you all next time. And a special thank you to Kim, James, Sarah and the rest of my supporters on Patreon and Subscribestar.